Your parents were Holocaust survivors, and you have said they despised the state of Israel. How did their experience shape your political thinking?
The fact that they despised Israel is simply a fact. Um, for very idiosyncratic reasons. They were fanatically pro-Soviet, pro-Soviet, pro-Russian. The two were the same back then, and they considered Israel's alignment with the West against the Soviet Union a betrayal because it was obviously, for anybody who's politically literate, uh, it was the Soviet Union that defeated the Nazis. 90% of the Nazi forces up until 1944 were on their Eastern Front. The Americans lost about 400,000 people in World War II. The British about 400,000. The Russians 30 million. Three times as many Russians died in the siege of Leningrad as the total number of Americans killed. The total number of British and Russians killed, excuse me, British and Americans killed, was still only two-thirds of the number of Russians who were killed in the siege of Leningrad during World War II. It's just stupid to compare the sufferings of the Russian people and the sacrifices of the Russians with those of any other country. The other exception, of course, is China, which lost about 25 million people to the Japanese, who were monsters during World War II, monsters. So my parents, since they were among the survivors, felt a deep debt to the Soviet Union.
Where
Uh,
were they from?
both of my parents were from Warsaw, Poland. After the uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was repressed in April 1943. They were deported. All the survivors, estimates about 20,000, were deported, 20 to 40,000, were deported to Majdanek concentration camp. My father ended up in Auschwitz and was on the Auschwitz death march. My mother ended up in a slave labor camp. My mother was liberated by the Russians, my father by the Americans. I don't hear you.
For their whole life, they were critical of Israel.
Yes, because they thought they were traitors. And my parents um, valued faithfulness and loyalty. They would, uh, in the darkest days of the Cold War, they would never utter a single word, never utter a single word critical of Russia or critical of Stalin. Never. Not so much.
Even when Stalin was accused of anti Semitism?
They denied it. I'm not saying they were right. I'm simply saying factually, uh, they would not bite the hand that fed them.
Mhm. And they have influence on your way of thinking about the Zionist question.
Um, I do believe in faithfulness. I don't. If you if you break faith, you have to have a very good reason. I mean, you have to have a very good reason. Uh, Sometimes you do. Sometimes you love your mother, you love your father, and then you discover they committed some horrible crime, and you have to choose between the love of your parent and um, the crime. There was a very good film by I guess it's Greek filmmaker, Costa Gavras. It was called The Music Box. Uh, Very worth watching, I think, because that dilemma arises in the case of that film. It's one of the better films in the Nazi Holocaust. It's not a spectacular, it's not Steven Spielberg, but on a micro level, it poses the question correctly, in my opinion. So yeah, faithfulness is important to me. It was very important to Professor Chomsky, by the way, maybe to a fault. Professor Chomsky would never, ever betray a friend. Never. I benefited from that because there are times when I came under very heavy criticism, not just from the right or the center, but also from the left. And he had reservations about things I said, as this is normal, and things I did, which is normal, but he would never publicly voice them. He had a very deep sense of faithfulness, from which, as I said, I benefited. Uh, so that value I took from my parents. You, your integrity cannot be purchased. My parents liked money, and there was a time when, because they were authentic survivors, most of the people who claim to be survivors, just complete mythology, just made up. I knew the survivor community. It was so tiny. It was so tiny. Most of the people who claimed to be were survivors. They survived in the Soviet Union. They went to the East. Uh, they didn't survive the Holocaust. They escaped the Holocaust by going to the Soviet Union. But when the Holocaust became an industry and everybody wanted to pretend to be a survivor, the escapees became survivors. They escaped the Holocaust. Very small handful survived the death camps, the slave labor camps, the ghettos. So, because my parents were authentic survivors, they were in a lot of demand during the heyday, the height of the Holocaust industry. A real survivor, the real McCoy, as my mother said. But that usually came with a price. The price was you had to denounce the Soviet Union. At the same, because of the whole issue back then of what was called Soviet Jewry and the oppression of the Soviet Jews. So those two issues were conflated. Uh, Remembering the Holocaust also at that time necessarily meant denouncing the Soviet Union and denouncing its treatment of Jews. So if you were invited to an event, you had to do two things. You had to give testimony to your experience during World War II, and you had to denounce the Soviet Union. My parents would never do the second. So they were never invited. Never, 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 never. They were never invited because the issue of the Soviet Union always came up, and my parents were not politically correct on that question. Now, you could offer them, believe me, I know my parents, you can offer them $100,000, which at that time was a lot of money. You can offer them $100,000, just denounce the Soviet Union. It'll never happen. Never, 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 never. They would never do it. And that part I got. I inherited from them. I appropriated from them.
Mr. Finkelstein, you have written a very important book, The Industry of Holocaust. Did Zionists illegitimately appropriate the Holocaust?
They turned it into they weaponized it. They weaponized the Nazi Holocaust basically to claim that no people in the world had ever suffered the way Jews suffered during World War II, and therefore you can't apply the same moral, legal, and political standards to Jews because their suffering was unique. And given that it was unique, you can't apply general principles uh, to them. That they're exempt. Unique suffering conferred on Jews unique exemptions from normal, conventional, legal, and moral standards. So they weaponized the Nazi Holocaust.